Hey everybody, what's up? It's Nick Davenport, aka Mr. Mental Muscle, and today we have the first inaugural episode of the Mental Muscle Podcast. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Tashiro. He's the author of two great books, The Science of Happily Ever After, as well as Awkward. And I'm a big fan of his work. I've talked about it numerous times on some of my channel posts. And we have him here today. We're going to discuss a bunch of different topics to help you with your everyday life, how you can maybe do better at dating or your already marriage or relationship, or figure out how you can use your awkwardness or other skills in society to be better. So with that being said, Dr. Tashiro, you can break down a little bit about your journey and we can get right into it.
Hey, thanks for having me on today. It's great to talk to you here through a conversation. So we know each other over social media for a while, but really excited to talk to you today. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background. My background's in psychology. So I went to graduate school for psychology at the University of Minnesota. And that was a really great institution and fit for my personality and kind of the way I like to learn. It just so happened that some of the first people to study romantic relationships using the scientific method were housed in the Department of Psychology at Minnesota. And so I just kind of, by serendipity, fell in with some of those folks and was just really taken by this research where they were describing and predicting things with something as, complex and abstract as romantic love. I just thought that was so cool. So enjoyed my time there, did research on the topic and took a job in academia as a professor for a number of years and taught a course that was kind of integral to where I'm at now. It was a undergraduate course on the psychology of romantic relationships. A lot of the it was a big class, like 200 students, but they talked a lot, which was great, right? Really interactive. They asked a lot of questions for friends of theirs about different romantic problems. And, one of the things that happened was when I'd be taking the metro from University of Maryland back to DC, and sometimes I would just kind of kick myself because I knew there was a better answer to give for some of these practical questions they had. There was a perfect study or set of studies that could have addressed the student's question, but in the moment, I just couldn't translate it fast enough. And so that kind of laid this idea for me that there's all this amazing research on romantic relationships. That wouldn't it be great to transport that information to a broader audience through books and other kinds of media. And so that's what I've been doing the past few years, is focusing on spreading the good word, really, about some of the great research on interpersonal relationships, whether that's romantic relationships or things like social awkwardness and social skill.
Well, I think that should be a required course for all students. We live in this very social world where, like you said, we're more connected than ever. That's how we literally met. So the fact that it's evolved in a way that the stuff maybe 30, 40 years ago that we consider normal social situations probably can't really, they can still fly, obviously, but they've kind of evolved into a different, I guess, set of rules or schemas on how we understand them in their moment.
Exactly. It seems like now, it's every year or two, like there's this turnover in these ways that we communicate with each other and what the social expectations are. And so it can be tough, whether it's just platonic kinds of relationships or romantic kinds of relationships. The technology has sped things up so much. I think it's hard for even the best of us to keep up sometimes.
It is. And I can actually personally relate to this because I was in a relationship with my daughter's mother. We're not together anymore. But when we broke up, it was about 2015. So from the time we started to the time we ended, let's say 2012 to 2015, I would say not just like social media started evolving, but dating apps. Because I remember being a kid, I'm 34 now. I'm not sure how old you are, Dr. Tashiro, but you probably can remember when, or definitely we both can remember when it was more like awkward to say, hey, we met online. And then when I got out of the relationship, it was the other way around. I had people saying, you should try Tinder or Bumble. And I'm like, what's that? Like, I was aware of it, but I wasn't really like into it. And it was weird for me because I'm kind of an introverted guy. So like you said, the rules, I didn't really understand. How do you talk digitally? Because when I went in, it wasn't that long before, but it was kind of like I was used to the rules of courting that kind of were slightly different before that.
Oh, absolutely. I guess what we call the meet cute now was just like the way you met people before, right? You'd meet face to face, and yeah, it was interesting. When I did the first book, The Science of Happily Ever After, on the dating. I started writing that, I think, in 2011, maybe 2012. And, and the crazy thing was that like app dating wasn't even a thing. Like Match and eHarmony were starting to be a thing, but there was still that kind of almost stigma against it, where you're like, oh yeah, we met online or whatever, which is wild to me because it's just like 10 years ago, right? And then when we did the update last year on that book, all of a sudden it was like, wow, it's app dating's now just everywhere. And it's also actually supplied a lot of great data for understanding romantic relationships and people's preferences and decisions.
So from your educated opinion, as well as maybe your personal opinion, would you say that it maybe has helped dating or hurt it, or maybe a little bit of both? Because I guess with every good, there comes some downsides.
Yeah. So I'm conflicted, to tell you the truth. So I'll try to explain this in a way that's somewhat clear, but I have these contradictory thoughts, I guess, and opinions in my head. So I think there's nothing wrong with online dating. And I think from the perspective of growing your opportunity or your dating pool, I mean, it's unbelievable, right? Compared to how most of human history has gone, where, my mom grew up in some small town. She went to, I think her senior class was like 12 students,
Oh, wow.
And she describes like the conundrum of finding a prom date and that kind of thing. It's like, but that was most of human history. Things were like that, right? So now we just have like hundreds or thousands of options. So I think in that way, it's great. I think if someone is, and if someone has preferences in dating that are not typical, then it can be great, and so I've certainly support it in that way. Now, here's the part where I get a little conflicted, though. So one of the kind of robust models they use to predict commitment in psychological research is called social exchange theory. And it's actually the same algorithm or the same model that they're using over in the econ department or business school to predict when people will buy and sell their house or their stock or whatever else. And it's just really it gets more complicated, but it's kind of three core elements. It's what do you want? Because, what are your expectations? What do you think you're getting out of the current investment or the current partner? And what are what they call attractive alternative options? So would there be other investments or other people that you think would meet your needs better? And you can kind of easily imagine between these three variables how that would predict commitment. Now, what online dating has done is it has exponentially increased people's perceived attractive alternative options. Yep. So, our minds aren't really ready to handle that kind of calculus. And so, a lot of the stuff you're hearing from Gen Z, for example, is that it's really hard to find a committed relationship for someone who's up for that. And I think with the online dating, and you think about that algorithm and those three variables, it's easier to understand how that would be the case, because people are always thinking like, the grass could be greener somewhere else.
Yep. And that's interesting because with Tinder, I don't know all of them. I think most of them are around the same amount, but you get about 100 or so swipes or matches a day. So that's the minimum. And I know you can buy packages where you get unlimited. So you can only imagine if you swipe, let's just say on minimum 500 people a day, you match with, say, I don't know the numbers, but maybe 10%. That's 50 people. That, like you said, we come from a time period where we had villages or towns of 500 to 1,000 people. You're exponentially expanding that, and what they call it, the curse of choice or illusion of choice, where the more options you have, the less likely you're going to make a decision. So, and I've used this term, I think I mentioned to you before, there's no more saber-toothed tigers. And it's like our brain, like you said, hasn't caught up with the adaptations that we're exposed to now. And I don't know where it's going to go. I'm curious to see what it looks like in another 20 years or so.
Exactly. Like I can barely, handle the complexity of one relationship, much less, juggling a bunch of different ones or trying to figure out among, say, 50 different options. And so, yeah, there's that tyranny of freedom or tyranny of choice that you talked about. And, it's as they say in that research, it's the same thing like going into Target trying to find a dish detergent or a laundry detergent. You're just like so overwhelmed with just too many options, and it can be kind of paralyzing when that happens. So yeah, I do think that applies to some of the dating difficulties that we're having, like kind of on a broader societal scale.
Well, running with that Target analogy, I like that. I actually used to work there a while back as a stocker, and I actually have stock detergents. So going with that analogy, we usually make choices sometimes off of frivolous decisions. So going back to the detergents, some may have better stain power, or some may last longer, or fresher colors. But going to the dating, comparing it, do you think we may make decisions based off of some frivolous things? I guess I want to segue into this, and it's one of my favorite things you've done is the 3-wish thing, and you talk about height and other factors, like how we make these decisions that may be arbitrary, that don't really lead to actual relationship success.
Yeah. So why don't we set up the kind of 3 wishes thing first, and then we can go to some of the frivolity we exhibit during partner selection. But yeah, so let's imagine like you have a fairy godmother, and she shows up. She says, "Hey, Nick, I'm going to give you 3 wishes for your ideal romantic partner." Well, great. That's fantastic. But as these fables go, you want to use those wishes wisely, right? So I give this example. Let's say there's a woman who's selecting among 100 eligible bachelors, kind of a bachelor type situation, right? And these gentlemen have been selected randomly from general population, and she gets to choose among these 100 folks, who she wants to go out with. Well, let's say she says, all right, I'm going to use my 3 wishes, and I want someone who's tall. And let's say to her, that means someone who is 6 foot or taller. Well, about 80 of those guys would walk out of the room at that point. They get cut, right? Because only about 20% of men are 6 foot or taller in the United States. Whoa. Okay. So that's a big drain, right? Now let's say she goes to her second wish. Let's say she says, I want someone who's hot. And to her, that means someone who's an 8 out of 10 or 80th percentile or better, right? And so what would happen is, about another 16 of the remaining 20 would walk out of the room. So just with 2 wishes, she's gone from 100 possibilities for partners, down to 4. And with almost any other wish she makes, she's going to be left with one guy or a fraction of a guy, right? And so it's unbelievable. And people can do this with their wishes. And we would do this in class all the time. I'd have students write down, what do you want? They'd write down, 15, 20, 25 things they want in a partner. And that's fine. I say, hey, yeah, go big, dream big. But then, I'd have people volunteer if they were okay with me having go through their list. And we would just see how their 3 wishes would quickly take them down to one person or a fraction of a person. So one of the main things people can do to improve their dating life, and I don't want people to settle. What I want people to do is I want them to get the traits and characteristics in a partner that are actually the most important to them. That's what I want. And so make a big list. But then what I would say is now be, really thoughtful about rank ordering the things you want in a partner, the wishes you have for a partner, from let's say 1 to 10 or even 1 to 20, and really emphasize those first 3 and be like, hey, what would be the 3 non-negotiable things that I absolutely need in a partner? And when people give it that kind of thought, I think we all have the wisdom within us to actually think about, okay, these are the things that are actually going to matter in the long run. When folks do that, they make much better decisions. So that's the 3 wishes, and then where that took me to next then was to think about, well, how do people actually spend their wishes? Is there data about that? And there certainly is. One of my, favorite studies that we did for the updated version that just came out from some of the online dating stuff was a study of Hinge users. And I think it was over 10,000, Hinge users. And they wanted to see a number of things. But one of the most interesting things they found was how long do people spend on a profile before they swipe on it? And as you can imagine, the results were a little disheartening.
Like 3 seconds?
Yeah, a little bit less. Yeah. So
less? Oh, I thought it was being conservative.
Yeah. No, about 2 seconds. people would look at and then they'd swipe right or left. And, one of the things that happens with online dating that I don't think folks always realize is that we can get careless because there's so many possibilities, right? But when you swipe left, that's a hard rule out. That means not only have you lost that person for whatever characteristics you were deciding upon, which is probably just the profile picture, right? What I see happening is, well, maybe you're losing someone with great character, moral character. Maybe you're losing someone with an unbelievable personality or unbelievable talents. All that's going out the window when you make those decisions with online dating, or if you're setting filter preferences ahead of time. Folks want to think through, like, this isn't just a preference, this is actually a hard rule out that I'm doing when I set these filters. So, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't go for someone who's attractive, or it's not okay to go for some of these a little more frivolous kinds of things, but dating should be fun. But at the same time, you don't want to let those kind of careless decisions get in the way of you getting what's actually really important to you.
Well, I guess that kind of goes into, and you've talked about this in your books, is like, what is the outcome of what are you trying to do with these people? Like, we've segued into, or I guess not even 100 years ago, let's just go 40, 50 years ago, the intent of marriage or dating was typically marriage. Now it's kind of like, there's new terms I'm sure you heard of, like situationship and things like that. And I think it's like, since we have these more options now, we don't even say, hey, I want to date him or her because I want to marry them eventually. It's because it's something to do. And like you said, they might look good or it might be fun. And I know you talk about novelty seeking. That's something I think I've experienced because I'm very introverted. So it's like, I'm not necessarily afraid to go out and have fun, but it's like, it's not necessarily the first thing. And I've noticed that that's been more, I guess, in the last few years, a big thing for people getting out and doing stuff, So it's like, if you're not, what they call it, the spark, if you're not going to spark their attention or spark that, whatever, the butterflies, it might be a deterrent, and that might be the best guy or girl for you. But that one or two dates, it just didn't do it for you. And now we have all this choice now. So they know, hey, I got 20 other people in my messages to try out next.
That's right. So there's the fallback, and you see those perceived attractive alternative options, right? Influencing people's decision-making behavior or their willingness to try to maybe give someone a second chance, like on a, like a second date or something like that, or letting something slowly develop. I don't think I've ever heard that phrase. There's rarely mentioned when I hear people's dating stories. So yeah, there's, two things you point out that I think are really great. And, the first one was just that, well, what is the end point, that people want? And it used to be pretty narrow. Well, you wanted to get married, you might get married by a certain age. Now, I don't know we want to go back to that necessarily, because that didn't always work for everybody.
Mhm.
But at the same time, like, all of a sudden, it's not unusual to hear folks like all of a sudden they're 40 and they're like, whoa, like, how'd I get here? And maybe they
Time
wanted
flies.
to settle down, but they were just, they weren't focused on actually what they wanted out of their relationship life. And I'm fine with people doing whatever they want. If someone wants to be single,
Mhm.
hey, great. If that's what's going to make you happy. But, once again, I think people just want to take some time to sit down, be thoughtful about it, and be like, hey, what's the end point I'm really shooting for here? And given that end point, now how can I work backwards and make some wise decisions about how to get there? And, once again, I think the good news is people have that wisdom within them. They just need to harness it and kind of focus it.
And that's why I like your work, because in my field, if you go into what I do, especially if it's with my sport teams or even my tactical, it's kind of the same approach. Like, I'm not necessarily going to make them a better fighter or a better police or a businessman, whatever population I work with. My goal is to educate them. Like you said, if they know better, they can sit on it. And it's like, okay, if I know how to process information under pressure, or I know these different cognitive biases, I'm big on teaching my athletes or my clients cognitive biases, because a lot of people make bad mistakes, not just because they're not good under pressure, is because they don't even realize how their thoughts are processed. So I'm big on mitigating the risk with my clients. So it's like, okay, if you know what's going to happen, then at least we may not be able to stop it, but we at least know which way we're going. And to segue into why I asked you before we did this about the red pill space or fresh and fit particularly is not more so to go into like their content specifically. I don't know if you checked out any contents, because they have a lot of viral clips that might come off unbecoming. But the reason I brought it up because they do something that I saw a parallel with some of your work, and they called it, for the sake of what it is, the delusional calculator. And it kind of takes the concept of the three wishes in a sense, but it just takes literal data from the U.S. Census as well as the Department of Labor, and I guess a few other factors that's from the government. And they put in all the girls that they ask this question, what they want, and it gives the exact percentage based on the census. So the last one was 3 years ago. So it's fairly recent. So they look at it and say, okay, it's 0.005. Or they'll say, okay, let's change it. They'll change the height or change the income or the race, whatever. And it'll be like 15%. And it's like showing them that you don't, and they say the same thing you say is like, you don't have to do this. It's your choice. But if your goal is to get married or do this or do that, you need to kind of have a plan and know what your options are, because the biggest rebuttal I hear to things like that is there's 7 billion people in the world. And I guess that's the illusion of, we know that we do have 7 billion people in the world. And with Tinder and social media, you can talk to someone in Africa, Japan, Russia, wherever. But what are the odds of that person being your actual dating market? And you factor in age, gender, whatever your specific gender choice. You've got to weed a lot of people out, or even married people themselves. You can't date married people, or you're not supposed to. But so it's like mitigating the risk, I guess, is the point. Is like people need to look at it like, or should look at it like that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, you know, and I think it's like people use probabilities really well in other parts of their life. You know, if someone was drafting a fantasy football player, all of a sudden they're a real scholar about probabilities, you know, okay, what's the probability this person scores X number of touchdowns, or, you know, the chances that you're going to average this number of points. They'll be like, hey, I'll take a 5% probability bump, right, for something this like fun, like fantasy football. But all of a sudden, like the dating life, it's like, no, I want everything and not think about probabilities. It's like, oh man, let's just, you know, let's apply some of that good intelligence you have to this thing that's actually more important, I would think, you know, in somebody's life. So, you know, and one thing I want to go back to real quick before we move on is like, I'm going to playfully disagree with something you said earlier, which is, I think you actually you're teaching people to be better boxers, or teaching people to be better athletes in the best way possible. This would be my opinion, because what you're doing, as I hear it, is you're not coming in heavy-handed saying, "Hey, this is the way you gotta, this is the way you gotta do things." You're saying, "Hey, here's the situation that we can anticipate, and here's some scaffolding to think about how that's going to play out, or some structure." Right? So some strategy, and let's just get you better about anticipating these things, right? And making it higher probability you're going to make the right decision or the best decision in situations, and, you know, trying to work against making the impulsive or bad decision.
Yeah.
You know, it's like some of the stuff you do with the Stroop task or some of these other cognitive tasks, you know, that's like a real life kind of playing out of, hey, let's be aware that sometimes our impulses can lead us to make the bad decision. And let's have some self-control, some executive function to say, all right, I understand the risk. Now, let's actually go to the secondary decision that I thought out ahead of time. That's actually the much more adaptive way to go. And, you know, for me personally, like I love that way of teaching. And I you know, I think that's how people learn the best. So, you know, I think the stuff you're doing with the conditioning, you know, whether it be for sport or police officers or whatever, I think that's the best way to do it.
I appreciate that. I should clip that and be an unpaid or a paid sponsorship for you, because you said it perfectly and I explained it just like that. And it's like, it feels good to hear someone else say it, because at the end of the day, our brain, our mind, I know it's cliche, but it's the most important part of it. Obviously, we need every part of our body, but it literally runs the show. It's the behavioral side. It's the physiological side. So we know, obviously, that's our backgrounds, but it's like, I see there's a segue, and we can use this as a transition into, like, say, how people are more aware of like mental health or just the mind, because people talk about mindfulness and people are more socially aware, or at least trying to be for the masses. So going into that, so let's talk about awkward. So we talked about relationships, dating, and this can kind of carry over, but I liked awkward too. I don't know which one I like better, but awkward was good, I think, for me at least, because I related to it a lot. Like I mentioned before we got on the call that I was about 6 feet going into high school. I was a jock. So I didn't really get the physical kind of like torments. But since my interest, I liked RPG video games like Zelda. I didn't really like sport games. Even though I love playing sports, I really didn't get into like Madden or anything like I had them, but it was not my go-to. So I don't really not get along, but I didn't really connect as much with my social group as much. But I typically got made fun of, but in a playful way, not like hey Nick, you're gonna get thrown in the trash. It's more so like, oh, look at Nick, he's out there reading in the library. And that's the actual tone I got before. Funny, right? Like reading is a bad thing, right? But yeah, so what is it that you think, like, well, I guess obviously you're an expert at this, but why is it that awkwardness is one, I guess, a problem, and two, how do you get to that point? What makes awkwardness?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you sharing that, because it's been one of the great joys actually of doing the awkward book is hearing from folks who have read it, and people who I would never think had a history of awkwardness are like, yeah, so I used to be super awkward, or I still am, or whatever. I'm like, oh wow, that's amazing, and yeah, there's some of the terminology I think is kind of good to sort out at the start. So like nerdiness, I kind of think of as overlapping. Like if you have a Venn diagram of, it's kind of two circles, I think it overlaps nerdiness with awkwardness. Now, nerdiness kind of taps into the part of awkwardness that I would call the obsessive interest. So, you tend to get really focused on something. It can be like a nerdy kind of topic, like books or a certain kind of video game or something like that. But it's really this deep immersion, and to the point sometimes it's not socially helpful all the time. Awkwardness in its purest form, I kind of think about as a difficulty or lack of ability with social situations. So it's not a total lack of ability, but it's just like, it's a profound kind of difficulty understanding social skills, understanding the rules of communication or what someone's trying to convey to you, or how to convey a message to somebody else clearly. And then the third component's like the obsessive interest, and getting really kind of narrowly focused on something, and sometimes having a hard time then, right, getting off that obsessive interest and onto other things like making eye contact or, attending to someone's social needs. So yeah, awkwardness doesn't make someone a bad person. But it does show some heritability. So people do have these kind of propensities towards awkwardness. But I've also found that over time, a lot of awkward people learn to be more what I call socially fluent, right? So they kind of get more smooth with understanding a wide range of social situations and how to navigate those.
Yeah, I like that term, socially fluent, because I can say, like, I can dabble in both sides. Like, I'm not like I can't go out type of person. I could, but I prefer being to myself, thinking in my thoughts. So that's why I would say I'm introverted. And due to social media, a lot of people think I'm more extroverted because, going back to how social media has taken over, they only see me there. They don't see me the 98% of my day when I'm sitting up here in my office just working on stuff, or if I'm in my downstairs doing something, recording content. So it's like they only judge off that. But I think with awkwardness, is like you said, they be socially fluent, but the people on the other side of the awkwardness, they're typically, it's another language to them. It's like they don't interpret it the way, the person seeing it in that real time moment might think this is what I'm supposed to do. And the person interpreting is like, wait, what are you doing? And even though they don't get like maybe ostracized, they usually end up being on the lower rung of the cool kids, or even as adults. I'm not gonna lie. As a kid, I grew up thinking like, when I get out of school, I'm gonna be the guy, and I'm gonna get my revenge by being successful. And I learned slowly but surely that wasn't the way to go, because now I've gotten better. I've adapted, obviously, because you learn these cues. Like, better at 25, 30 versus 6, not to like just look off into the distance while someone's talking to you. Or I think you mentioned like certain regions of the face to look at, like the chin versus the eyes, or correct me if I'm wrong.
I know that's totally right. So there's kind of a number of predictable behaviors that accompany social awkwardness that explains why awkward people have a hard time deciphering social cues, or kind of knowing what to do. And you're referring to one of my favorite studies, which are these eye tracking studies. So they can do these fancy lab setups where they can watch where the pupil is focused on a computer screen within millimeters. And in some of these tasks, what they'll do is they'll flash faces on the screen, and they'll say, hey, just pay attention to these faces as they pop up, and we'll have some questions for you. And what they find is that people who are socially fluent their eyes reflexively focus on the eye region of those faces. And that's a really good thing to do, because the eye region is the most information rich part of the face, right? If you want to know what someone's feeling and what they're thinking, what their intent might be, no place better than to look, as the eyes to the window to the soul, as they say, right? But the awkward people, what they find in those eye tracking studies is that when the picture pops up, they reflexively look at the chin or at the corner of the ear. And those are much less information rich areas of the face, right? But what I like about that is it shows you in a really concrete way that the awkward person is behind right away then, right, in the social interaction, because they are not looking where they need to look. The other thing I like about those studies is the explanation for why that occurs. And so sometimes people think, like, if an awkward person is not looking them in the eye, that the awkward person is not paying attention, or they're being disrespectful or something like that. But in fact, the best explanation is that they're averting their eyes to the chin or the corner of the ear or their shoes, because looking in the eye region is too overstimulating for them. Almost like if you're a socially fluent person, if you're ever talking to someone who looks in the eyes for way too long and doesn't break eye contact, it gets like too intense. Like, that's kind of what it feels like for an awkward person all the time. And so they're actually looking away so that they can regulate themselves and listen to what you're saying, or stay engaged with what you're saying. And so that's just one of those little things where it's like, if the awkward person can understand, okay, this is what's happening, I'm getting overwhelmed, but then learn to work through that intensity, and the person who's not awkward can have some empathy for the situation until the awkward person gets up to speed, then they can overcome that situation, get the awkward person to build the skill necessary. And for me, it was the same thing when I was a kid. Like, I had a hard time looking people in the eye, and fortunately I had great parents who kind of drilled me almost in an athletic or military like way to get better at looking people in the eye and making appropriate eye contact. And they'd always say, like, hey, Ty, you do that, we know it's uncomfortable, but you're doing that to make the other person feel at ease and to make the other person feel welcome. And when they would add that additional explanation, that was really motivating for me, because of course I wanted people to feel like engaged and feel like I was interested in who they were and what they were about.
See, that's all I like having these conversations, because that information right there, I guarantee most people don't know, and they wouldn't even think to know. It's not that they're, I guess, for lack of a better word, they're ignorant of it, but it's not that they want to be mean or think they're getting disrespected, because I know for a fact I've had interactions just like that where people thought I wasn't listening, and getting into like maybe even the cognitive side of it. You say it's overwhelming. It's going to be hard to process information, talking about like what working memory and stuff like that, when I'm just trying to figure out my mood state, let alone what you're saying, and that's just overwhelming. But most people are going to see it as, what's going on, man? We're just talking. And it's like you're misconstruing that for something. I guess most people, I would say, I won't put a number on it, but most people, it's just a conversation. For them, it's like a fully engaged task, almost like you have to really put effort. Like something most people say is like walking, it's a marathon for other people, or I guess more so a Olympic level sprint, I should say.
Yep. No, exactly. And so I think, one of the nice things about doing I'd forgotten about some of my awkwardness, fortunately, I guess, because in adulthood, I'd, figured out I'd be socially fluent in enough situations. But gosh, when I went back to some of those stories from my, teenage years and childhood, I was like, wow, I was a super awkward kid. But it made me even more grateful for just how patient and understanding a lot of folks were in my life, whether they were friends and peers, or coaches, adults who were mentors. the best thing I think folks can do, everybody knows someone who's a little bit awkward, right?
Mhm.
They have someone in their life, like, if you can just think first, like what's the person's intent, and I think this can go for all of us, maybe in a lot of different social situations. Like just taking the time, think about, hey, what do I think this person's intent is? And do I think it's good? And for most people, right, we're going to be like, yeah, hey, this person, I think this person has good intent. Then it can slow us down a little bit to be like, so then what's going on with this interaction or with these social cues or behaviors that are happening? And then, with that distance and that space and empathy, then it can be like, all right, so some of these little things happening right here that are leading to a cumbersome social interaction aren't a big deal, actually.
Mhm.
And then we can get through things and get to a good place. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I got into the awkward topic in the first place. Was I was observing some of my awkward friends in social interactions and watching them not do well, like at bars or parties or whatever. And I was like bummed out for my friends who were awkward. But yeah, I had this thought, like, here's this person who has, this tremendous character, who's been an amazing friend to me, who's super interesting in so many ways, and they're getting shut down by these other people, based on 3 or 4 minutes of social interaction. And then the other person's like, oh, I gotta go get a drink, or I gotta go to the restroom, or whatever. I'm like, if awkward people could just skip those little niceties, those
Yeah.
small little social things that happen, the small talk and everything in the first 3 or 4 minutes, I was like, I think they'd actually be doing a lot better. So yeah, it's one of the weird things about awkwardness is it's just the small things that tend to trip up awkward people. But if you're patient and you actually get to know the person, you oftentimes find someone who's really just a fascinating, interesting person.
I agree with that because it's kind of like the social cues that just society over the X amount of years humans existed is like you say, hey, how you doing? Fine, how are you? It's the automatic response no matter what. Some people might take a brief moment and say, I'm not really doing fine. But they say, wait, and they respond, fine, how are you? But that brief moment, they had to really process it. So it's like you say, if we get to the more deeper conversation or the more the depth of the conversation, it's going to show that, oh, this guy or this girl, she's pretty interesting. And it's like, but I guess these formalities are just as a part of our cultures. And I don't care where you go, there's some form of that, right? So it's
It's
like,
some kind of like social contract, right? Like we're going to do the shake hands, and we're going to, how are you? I'm fine. And these kind of social niceties. It's kind of like, okay, so we understand the same playbook almost, and so I guess we can be cool with each other. But, a lot of times now in society, we don't go past that. Like so much of our stuff, because of social media or texting or whatever else, it like doesn't go past it doesn't allow as easily to get into more depth. But that's really where the good stuff
Yeah.
is, of course, right? So yeah, no, I think it's interesting. And, as an aside, I'll say, like, I think it's been one of the things that was interesting to me, kind of going through the research on the psychology of awkwardness, was thinking about athletes sometimes, who have that obsessive interest. And, some of my favorite athletes of all time, uh, were kind of awkward people, actually, when you got down to it. Now, they had learned to be good, to be socially fluent, like in front of the camera or in, kind of selected spaces. But the more you heard about them, the more you're like, wow, this person actually was like pretty awkward. But as part of that awkwardness, their razor sharp focus and that kind of like tireless persistence was actually a key ingredient to them achieving extraordinary things in their sport. So, that's the other side of awkwardness is, while awkward people can struggle with some of these kind of mundane social niceties, they have this like kind of tiger inside, right? Where, boy, they can really focus in on things, and they will just be like obsessive about their pursuit of certain goals.
and is that what you call the rage to master?
The
That's
race, yeah, the race, and one of my favorite psychological terms. Yeah, so this woman, Ellen Winter, who studies gifted youth,
okay.
I kind of coined that term, and it's just such a great description, right? And some of the elite athletes you've probably been around.
I've seen it firsthand. Yeah. So I didn't make it to that level. So I was kind of like that. But for all the ones that did make it to the highest level, they are exactly what you, and honestly, since I like personality psychology and I dabble in that as well, I always look at those things because you see them on, like I said, on TV. I get the fortune to see some of the highest level athletes when they're not on the screen. And I can see how their behaviors, mannerism, and you described it perfectly. And I guess there's a carryover because, like you said, you have to have that difference to go. Because I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, to be more socially fluent, you kind of have to conform a little to some degree. It's not saying it's a bad thing, but you kind of have to go with the crowd to some extent. And going back to what you said, an athlete, they're not going to go to the party tonight. They're going to the weight room. I've done this. I have athletes who've done this. They're not going to say, hey, let's watch a marathon of this reality show. They're going to watch something that's going to better their game or whatever. So it's like I said, you kind of have to, and I think you mentioned in the book as well, is like throughout human history, why didn't it get sorted out of the gene pool? And you mentioned like kind of like, if you didn't have those people, when we have adapted to getting things that we call now modern conveniences, but those things didn't just come overnight. Someone had to think outside the box and be like, wait a minute, instead of doing it this way, what if I tried it this way? And they're like, that's weird. But then it's like, wait, that takes a third of the time. And next thing you know, we have irrigation and roads and whatever else. And now we got planes. And so it's like, it's a gift and a curse. And I don't like to say curse because given the topic of your book, it's a great thing. Like, we're not all meant to be the same. And that's what society's about, right? Our differences and things of that nature. So that's why I love your work. And before we close it out, I want to ask, you can do, well, we got 5 minutes. So I would ask, it could be either for awkwardness or romantic relationships, but something you can give, like if you just gave one quick 1 to 2 minute advice on, if I was to go from this statement out into the dating world or into my social awkward or being less social awkward, what would that advice be? If you could just sum it up in like a kind of like a 1 to 2 minute, like to leave them on that note.
I certainly get to that. I can't resist though to bring up one quick analogy. So I love what you said about the athletes, and it made me think about. I don't know if you saw this documentary about the Dream Team that came out recently.
I heard about it, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, it's great, and some of the athletes were talking about this night they all went to the club, and so they all go to the club. These Dream Team athletes, and they're having a great time, and they get back like 4 or 5 in the morning, kind of stumbling through the lobby, and they bump into Kobe. And Kobe is like in his gym shorts, and they're like, "Go, what are you doing, man?" And he's like, "I'm gonna go practice. I don't know what you all fools are are doing, but I can go to the gym." And so here he is, like, just obsessed with his craft and honing it. And, before you knew it, guys are showing up, maybe not 5 in the morning, but guys are showing up 7 a.m. in the gym, doing the same thing, getting that same obsessive kind of spirit. And like, a lot of the teammates said like that was actually key to that group's success, was this kind of razor sharp focus and persistence that Kobe modeled for everybody else. So anyways, I thought it was a cool kind of example. I think, when it comes to awkwardness in general, and if people kind of thought about, so what's the key to not being awkward or better navigating my social situations and my social life, to me, it kind of comes down to 2 things. Like when I think about my relationships with other people, I think there's 2 things I can expect and 2 things that they should absolutely expect from me. Number one, am I being fair? Okay, so are things relatively equitable between me and the other person? That could be an exchange of time. That could even be an exchange in a conversation. Like, am I listening to and attending to the other person, giving them an opportunity to speak and talk about the things that are interesting to them? It could be all sorts of different things, but, fundamentally, is this relationship fair? And to do that, because we're a little bit selfish, we kind of have to overcorrect and try to give a little bit more, or be a little bit generous, or be a little more kind than we might naturally be. So over contribute just a little bit, to be fair. The second thing is to be thoughtful. And we're going to have differences of opinion. We're going to make mistakes, in our social relationships and trip up. But, for me, if the other person had been thoughtful about it, that goes a really long ways towards me being cool with our difference of opinion, or the differences that we have in our interpersonal relationship. So, be thoughtful, be fair. I think if people really work and focus on exhibiting that in every aspect of their interpersonal relationships, the data would suggest that they're going to be just great, right? In the long run, as far as building long-term relationships that are sturdy and gratifying.
Yes, I agree 100%. Couldn't have said it better. People might seem basic, but if we practice it, I'm sure it could be more effective and efficient. So to close it out, drop any plugs for anything you got going. I think you have this new project you're working on. You want to plug that? Is that out yet?
I did a couple of new online courses with this company called InfoJoy, and really enjoyed that. That was a cool kind of new project for me to do. I did a course on dating, another course on awkwardness. Yeah, if people want to learn more, they can just go on my website or social media, and got the books out there as well. We just had the second edition of The Science of Happily Ever After come out, and but yeah, I hope this was of interest to some folks or helpful in some kind of way, and really appreciate the opportunity to get to chat with you. I think we've shared a lot of common interests, and so it was really fun to talk about some of these things.
No, I'm very grateful. Thank you for coming on, and I appreciate it. So, got that, guys. If you want to learn more about better interpersonal relationships, whether it be dating, friendship, familial, or just being better socially as a person in society, check out The Science of Happily Ever After, as well as Awkward by Dr. Tashiro, and get your mind right as always.